Okay, so we're about halfway now, and I've got the Prime Minister number 26, the Earl of Derby, Lord Derby, you can also title him as. Um, he succeeded Russell, and he was in office on three occasions from 1852, for a brief period in 1852, 1858 to 1859, and 1866 to 1868. On Wikipedia, it points out that he is one of only a handful of men to have had three or more periods in office. The others, I believe, were Gladstone, um, possibly Disraeli, Russell. But this time in Victorian politics, there was a lot of back and forth between prime ministers, people like Derby, Russell, Palmerston, a lot of back and forth between them. So that's something that's may say something about the nature of British politics at that time. Um, Bearing in mind the monarch had a lot more influence than she does today, but still a constitutional monarch. Um, he had a relatively brief time as prime minister. Nevertheless, he was the longest serving leader of the Conservative Party, even longer than Churchill or Thatcher. He was leader of the Conservative Party from 1846 to 1868, so that's a credible 22 years. Given that Attlee was leader of the Labour Party for 20 years, I think that would make Derby the longest serving leader of any major British political party. He is sometimes classed as the first Conservative Prime Minister because Peel can be seen as both a Tory and a Conservative. But arguably, the Earl of Derby, who was nicknamed Derby Dilly, I'm not quite sure where that nickname came from, but he was arguably the first of the Conservative Prime Ministers. One quick point about Lord Russell, which I forgot to mention, and this is worth mentioning. Russell was both the last Whig Prime Minister and in A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Dickens actually wrote in remembrance of many public services and private kindnesses. So that indicates Dickens was good friends with Lord Russell. And that figures both men were compassionate and clearly cared about social reforms. But back on to Derby. Um, Also by Wikipedia, he was known before 1834 with Stanley, and from 1834 to 1851 as Lord Stanley. His full name, Edward George Geoffrey Smith Stanley. I don't think you could get much more upper crust than that. He was born at Knowsley Hall, which is in present-day Liverpool, in 1799. And when he came to office, he would have been in his 50s when he first came to office. Um, just to give you a bit more background, like I say, he was the first Conservative Prime Minister, um, and he was the 14th Earl of Derby. Quite often, when we talk about Prime Ministers, we talk about like the Duke of Wellington, the Earl of Derby, and so on. This can sometimes cause confusion in historical reference. For example, if you see the film The Duchess, that refers to the Duke of Devonshire. I should emphasise that Duke of Devonshire was not the Prime Minister, but rather his father. So sometimes with the British peerage, it can cause confusion. Where in the case of the Duke of Wellington, he was the first Duke, but with many other Prime Ministers, they were well into the line of succession with their respective peerages. Um, Derby Dilly wasn't a nickname, but it was a political grouping that he formed. Um, and he attempted to chart a middle course between what they saw as increasingly radical Whiggery of Lord Russell and the conservatism of the Tories. But Sir Robert Peel, um, his 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 writing of the Tamworth Manifesto, um, basically took away that Derby Dilly program that would probably given Derby a lot more attention. There is a daguerreotype of Derby, so he was arguably the second prime minister to be photographed in that sense. Um, his term in office, like I say, it amounted to just over 3 years. So the terms were not particularly eventful. Not a great deal happened in those years. Although it should be noted that Victorian, the Victorian Empire, the British Empire at this time, was engaged in many overseas conflicts. Um, for example, we had the Anglo-Maratha Wars, the Anglo-Sikh Wars, the Opium Wars. A lot of those crossed over from one prime minister to another. So if I'm not mentioning them, it's not because they're not significant or it's not because they're not happening, but it's because they tended to cross over from one prime minister to another. They weren't necessarily at the, whereas by contrast, modern wars have been more the agenda or the policy of one particular prime minister, although it still crosses over. Um, give you a bit of personal information about Darby. One speech that's attributed to him: "My lords, I am now an old man, and like many of your lordships, I have already passed the 60 years and 10. My official life is entirely closed, my political life is nearly so, and in the course of nature my natural life cannot now be long." Presumably he said that towards the end of his life. He actually served in Whig administrations as well as Tory administrations. He served in the Whig administration, just checking some references here. Um, seeing, yeah, he served as Chief Secretary for Ireland under Earl Grey, who of course was a Liberal. Um, and he had several other ministerial positions. Um, he actually began his administration as a Whig in the same way that Gladstone began as a Tory. He became Member of Parliament for Stockbridge, I believe that's somewhere in Yorkshire, then for Preston. He was appointed Chief Secretary for Ireland in Lord Grey's administration, and he brought in the Irish Education Act of 1831. He became Colonial Secretary under the Earl Grey, introducing measures for the emancipation of slaves in the British Empire. He resigned over proposals to take surplus revenues from the Irish Church. Having argued with members of the Whig Party, he eventually got closer to Robert Peel and in 1837 joined his Tory party. In 1841, under Peel, he was appointed Secretary of State for War in the Colonies in Peel's second administration. And during his time in the post, he had responsibility for major issues such as the Opium Wars of China, but resigned when he disagreed with Peel over repealing the Corn Laws. He became Prime Minister in 1852, like I said. Peel's supporters refused to back him, forcing him to form his cabinet with loyal but inexperienced Conservatives. Um, by the end of the year, his government has collapsed, and Chancellor Disraeli, as he then was defeated. His budget was defeated. His second administration, briefly from 1858 to 1859, achieved more, although it was still dependent on divisions among the opposition for survival. Around the same time, there was acts such as the India Bill of 1858, which transferred control of the East India Company to the Crown. Actually, I should say a very pivotal event happened at this time, which was Indian Mutiny. Actually, I believe that happened in 1857, so that would have been under Palmerston, I believe. Like I say, a lot of this crosses over. Um, Another important act was the Jews Relief Act, which ended the exclusion of Jews from sitting in Parliament. So arguably that was the last major act of discrimination ended during his administration. In 1859, his attempt to widen the franchise led to his government's downfall. So although a conservative, he actually made some significant reforms as well. And that's an interesting thing about Victorian politics. It's not quite black and white. He returned to government as Prime Minister for a third time in 1866. His final government was responsible for the landmark Second Reform Bill of 1867, not as famous as the first, but nevertheless very important in the democratisation of Britain. Ill health forced Derby's resignation the following year, um, and that same ill health caused his death in 1869. His last words when asked how he was bored to utter extinction. There's a monument to him in London's Parliament Square. He was 70 when he died. So I think the conclusion we can make with Derby was he was a mediocre prime minister. He can't be seen as outstanding. He is historically significant as the first conservative prime minister in the proper sense, and he did make some important bills. Um, but one of our more outstanding prime ministers, probably not. So I'd rank him probably around average or maybe in the lower tier. Nevertheless, three separate terms of office and a very long political career. So that is the Earl Derby. Um, yeah. Leave it there.